Hello, everyone. Hi, Felwine.
Hello,
How are you?
I'm fine. And you?
I'm wonderful. It's a pleasure to be here with you both and with all of you. And I'm going to start us off with a more personal question by way of introduction, if I may. So before we delve into the more professional and philosophical questions related to art and politics, in particular projects that you've worked on, I wanted to first address kind of how you define yourself. In the media and press, you are referred to variously as a musician, poet, philosopher, playwright, economist, cultural heritage expert, and so many other descriptors. So how do you primarily define yourself these days, at present? Yeah.
So I want to start by saying that I'm very happy to be here. So thanks, David, and all the team for inviting me, and thank you for your presence here. So it's a very difficult question. I always thought that the definition don't define us. And I always thought that we are not under the umbrella of those categories. And sometimes we are trapped by the category of what we are doing or our scholarship, our disciplines, etc., etc. And my inner feeling is that we are more than all those definitions. And I have been trying to escape the definitions. It's why I jump from music to university to novels to scholarly work. And when I feel that I'm trapped in a definition, I try to escape it, So I think if I would choose one or pick one, I would pick the one of the writer, because I think the writer is an umbrella under which I can just aggregate all these different dimensions, scholarly work, writing novels, music. For me, all these are space of transmissions. And the question for me is what I'm transmitting and what I'm allowed to transmit in an academic setting. It's an authorized knowledge. So this knowledge that is curated by generation of scholars, and you came at a place, at a moment, in a long history, and you do your part. If you write a novel, you transmit, I would say, an existential knowledge, life experience that you, through your own sensitivity to the singularity of your gaze, but you try to transmit something. When you do music, you transmit vibrations. You transmit, and those vibrations came from different layers of your beings. So I think all these are an attempt to be in relation with people and to transmit something from a specific place.
Thank you very much. Well said. Yeah. So it seems that whether you're doing your academic work, activism, and creative pursuits, you are transmitting and communicating, and indeed are a storyteller. Next question.
You sure you don't want to?
Take it away.
Okay, because I'm just gonna kind of like dive into one text. At least I'll just start with one text, or maybe actually before I dive in, maybe I'll ask you if you could. So starting from between 2016 to 2002, you started the Atelier de la Pensée with Shindembe in Dakar, where a very kind of like multidisciplinary audience and group of participants share a space to theoretically rethink both the future of Africa, as well as the present, what you call the real of Africa, and you all, and the point of departure, of course, and this is something that we encounter a lot. This is like perhaps one of the main motifs in your work is the challenge of thinking Africa with and against Western conceptual tools. So I was wondering if you could perhaps start by giving a sense of what has happened since 2016 to the audience.
Yes. In 2016, Axelle and I decided to create the Atelier de la Pensée in Senegal. And I think that, the main idea was that if you want to transform African societies, we have to know them, understand them, and probably renew the categories through which our social dynamics, economic dynamics, political, anthropological dynamics was read. And we had the feeling that the colonial library was not so accurate, and probably we have to think again. And most of African countries were caught and are always trapped in the teleologies. The one is the economic development. They are supposed to be underdeveloped, so they have to develop themselves. But the only way that was proposed to them was the historical trajectories of Western countries. And a lot of thought, a lot of writings, a lot of scholarly work exists on a lot of dimensions of our societies, but we thought that probably rethinking, starting again the journey of looking at the societies and try to understand their current dynamics, their deeper transformations, was probably a fundamental step to the transformation. So thinking through I would say academic spaces, but also through the imaginaries. What the imaginaries that are produced on African societies were telling us. So the artists, their discourse is very important because there is somewhere a space of thought, imagination, imaginaries, etc. And we decided to gather writers, scholars, artists in Senegal from Africa and the diaspora in a transdisciplinary setting, and try to build a space of thought, of thinking, etc., around questions that interest African societies, but not only. But also our ideas was that we can think around critical issues that concern the global world from a place that is called Africa, because Africa is not outside of this dynamic. And we studied that work, we did it. So we have done 4 editions of the atelier and 3 of the doctoral school, and we are heading to the 5th. We published some books out of those gathering, and I won't say that we renew the thought, but I think there's very interesting contributions in those books that just are a collection of the essay or the talks that were given there, and those essays are food for thought about African dynamics, intellectual, social, and political. And I think it was much needed, because when we were thinking about creating that space, we weren't realizing the demand. The demand was absolutely important to rethink, to think again, and to start again a journey of thinking. And just to say that things are not set in stones for always, and probably this activity is a part of the transformation. It's not just about making revolution at a for political level, but also trying to make revolution at an epistemological level, or at the level of imaginaries. So it seems for us important to open that space.
Thank you. I have a few. We'll continue this this conversation by the atelier. Yes, there's 2 volumes. The proceeding from the meeting in 2016, and the proceeding from 2017. I'll be reading from both of them later, but it looks, at least it seems to me, I'm less familiar with your later work on the plural.
That's it.
Yeah. But it seems to me that what you just explained is very much kind of almost like a manifesto of such an institution.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Because the idea here is that probably one of I would say the framework is how to open the space for a plurality of way of knowing, a way of dealing with reality, a plurality of way of understanding, and how to bring those type of knowledge, I won't say in academia, but in a space that is built on the idea of the diversities of approach, of gnosis, of epistemologies, and all those knowledge are useful tools that we need to respond to all the challenges we have. And probably my feeling. I've been raised in the academia. It's been all my life. It's an interesting space, but it's a space of a specific way of producing knowledge. When you enter in academia, you sign a contract about a type of knowledge around textuality, knowledge that is inscribed or encoded in the writings, a type of rationality. And it's just a narrow window of knowing. It's not all the knowledge, but academia or is so dominant, so hegemonic, etc. And the so-called scientific knowledge is so hegemonic that most of the time it veils as a way of knowing. And society, to sustain themselves, always produce knowledge, know-hows, and they've been able to transmit those type of knowledge to just sustain their life, through historical times. So if you look at a lot of African societies, if they are here actually, and if they are currently living, it means that they've been able, through times, to produce knowledge that they need, to transmit it and to enrich it. And those type of knowledge in the DNA of African societies are absent of our intellectual spaces. They are absent of our universities because they are not respected and they are not considered as knowledge because they just came from different epistemologies. So the idea here, I think the premises were in the volume, but the idea is to create a space that we call a pluriversity, opposing to the university, and to think how to just host and acknowledge those type of knowledge and put them in an ecology where they can interact and produce different types of knowledge and open the scope or the geography of reason, or open the scope of what does it mean to know or try to know.
Thank you. When you were discussing the convenings that you've organized, you said briefly something that I thought was really powerful that I'm going to ask if you'll speak about a little bit more, about how important the role of the artist is in some of these discussions. So I'm going to ask you an intentionally broad question and answer it however you feel moved to. What does art have to do with politics? If we define politics, I'll give you a little bit of a definition, as the ways in which a particular geography is governed or how power is distributed, what is the utility of art with respect to those definitions?
I think deeply the question is the question of the means living together to organizing the city, the place, or the community, building rules of how we decide to live together. And I think the other part of the question is related to the end, to the finality of the livings. I think probably we need to organize a political community and set up, a type of rules that we will respect to be able to live together, to solve our contradictions and to be a community, not just a collection of individuals. But I think probably the question of why are we living for, the deep question of the sense of the finality. So art try to respond to those questions. And I think politics is an intermediary step. So we need to organize politics, but we are not living just to answer to our biological needs. We are living for greater purposes. And I think those purposes, so the question of which are those purposes, the art space is the space to think about those, to reflect and to just propose something. So I think that these two dimensions, how to live, how to organize the material and the practical condition of life is one thing. And what are we living for is the purpose of art.
Thank you for that. Desmond?
I was so sure you had. Okay. I was deciding whether I should go, since you were talking about politics, whether I should go to this motif, but that of the political versus, or rather, what politics mean, or if there is indeed perhaps a difference between politics and the political. But I I'll save that for later, and go back to this is and the this question of politics. It was prompted by the second volume from the second meeting, where the convening participant were all thinking about a politics of time from the continents, or what would be an African politics of time, and what would be the method of politicizing time. So I'll go back there later. So I'm just gonna bring us back to 2016, and I think it's important. So I'm gonna be the devil advocate here, right, and ask you. So I understand the question of, or rather, the importance of plurality, or the importance of multiple ways of knowing the real, that are perhaps significantly antithetical to what you name several times. Sometimes is the colonial library, which you a phrase that is inspired by Valentin Mudimbe. But you also often talk about Western knowledge, Western conception of knowledge. And here's so, and the one of the way of finding a method that would capture the real of Africa is, you say, to avoid the trap of the colonial library. And I'll name a couple of, like, the three main bad guys. Is the omnipotence of the subject, a material conception of objectivity. There is, like, to be objective, you have to be palpable or material in that sense, and the search for truth. And I'll read, I'm going to read a passage from that text. This is from Writing About the Humanities from the Vantage Point of Africa, and is from the first volume of the Proceedings to write the Africa World, écrire l'Afrique Monde. So I quote you: European thought has mainly been driven. Sorry, it was not Western. European, that's what I meant. European thought has mainly been driven by the search for truth. It's through this central notion that it was forged. However, in African or Asian practices of thought, the search for truth is not the primary concern. In the latter practices, vitality, vital force, the livable, the viable, these seems to be the knots that this thought seeks to untangle. The idea of truth, understood as an adequacy of the thing to the mind, is not transcultural. Moreover, the thing must be palpable, present, material, in order for there to be truth. What about, in this case, the future, the probable, the possible, the contingent, the objects of metaphysics? So here would be like a kind of like, I find that this passage sort of like captures, if we were to find a definition of European thought in these essays, I thought that this was a good one. But I was wondering, what colonial library are you talking about? Because it seems to me that there is a certain tradition, especially that emerged at I would say, like a post-war European tradition, that actually it's quite, or actually, no, I'll go all the way back to Freud. You know, one of and I hate to say, I'll also name Heidegger. You know, one of the account of truth that we encounter in this 20th century tradition is actually one that does not center the subject. You know, can you hear me? Yeah. Yeah, like the discovery of the unconscious, let's say Freud, is precisely the moment where the subject is kind of like, oops, I actually thought that I knew myself, but I don't know myself. Therefore, what I know about the world is already significantly compromised. I would say the same about Foucault, notion of or when he says, you know, men was a recent invention, which is also a text, The Order of Thing, Les mots et les choses, that you cite in one of in Afrotopia, I think. The moment of the invention of men is precisely, it's very recent, you know, 19th century. Why? Because at that moment, actually, this kind of omnipotent subject that has absolute dominion on the world discover himself as both subject and object of experimentation and subject and object of knowledge. So that's sort of like a bizarre bifurcation also somewhat compromises the centrality or this power of the subject. And I can continue, you know, Derrida, his own account of truth is very much connected to undecidability. So I wonder, what is the relationship between the kind of decentering and recentering of European epistemologies that it's very much, that is driving or inspiring both the atelier and this meeting, and this later tradition that is actually quite close, I would say, to a later kind of like post-colonial, and that I'm thinking about both the subaltern as studies as well as Axelle's own, you know, reformulation of the post-colonial. So there seems to be like this relationship between that tradition, or at least that tradition has been helpful in thinking. Yeah, there you go.
Thank you, Axelle. There's a lot in the question, so I will start by yes, there's a lot, but I will start by the colonial library. I think the definition of the colonial library I have is the one of Valentin Mudimbe. Is that knowledge that was produced on African societies since the 15th centuries by anthropologists, ethnographers, travelers, etc., etc., and that knowledge aim was to govern colonial states and to produce knowledge on, you know, on different dimensions of African societies to be able to, in the sake of governmentality. And one of the debates this last year is, what are we going to do with that colonial library? Some scholars say it's a co-production. We don't have to bury it, but you have to look at it critically. But the question of how we know African societies is an important one. And the hegemony of that library leads us to a dominance of the knowledge from the outside. African societies, they don't wait to encounters to know themselves, to produce knowledge on themselves. And Soyinka, when he was asked this question, responded that probably another way to know African societies is from museological point, from the inside, to know them from the inside, to see how they portray themselves, how they talk about themselves, what are their conceptions of time, of truth. Even though ontology is not a universal quest, some societies were always asking themselves why things are, and other societies ask themselves, things are here, how are we going to sustain them? And even though ontology was connected with the Greek languages and how the languages were organized, you know, all the word of Alexis Kagame, Bonvenis, etc. So there are different questions. The question, I think the main question was how to produce knowledge on African societies that is not captured by this colonial library, by these categories that pretend that they are able to explain the diversity, the complexity of those dynamics with, I would say, some préjugés, with a lot of préjugés and some prejudice, and how to start again a kind of journey of knowing again, or better knowing. And if you take some categories or some of epistemology or ontology or metaphysics, and you just transpose them in contexts where those questions are articulated differently, you are just in a kind of intellectual, conceptual hegemony, but you are not clarifying and you are not explaining. So this was first. The second is probably the social science and the humanities were captured at the beginning by the methods of the so-called hard sciences and the physics, and this idea that to know you must have an object and a subject that is detached intellectually from the object and that is able to collect reliable data and to have a kind of objective way of dealing with that. When the quantum physics arrived, we knew that the object changed the subject, and the position of the subject affect the object. And in social science, it's very difficult to cut the reality in slow portion and to piece them back after, because the object have their own density, and the clear separation between the object and the subject is very difficult. Even though in economics, you're the subject, but also you're the object of the economic thought. And the idea that you can detach yourself and just look at the world from an outside point of view, it seems to be a false idea. And the question is how to know, being involved, in the gesture of knowing, and being also an object of knowledge while you try to know something that includes you. And it's why this dichotomy that was useful at the beginning of the social science became very difficult at the end, because we are now able to collect a lot of information, have a lot of knowledge by dividing the reality in different pieces, by specializing ourselves, but we are less intelligent because we have difficulties to just articulate the totality. So I think this critique was a methodological critique that always exists, that already exists in the social science, in the humanity, and in the science in general, with this idea of objectivity, etc., that is much more, that is less, I would say, a cornerstone of how we know things, actually. I agree with Derrida and Foucault, the deconstruction of Derrida and the shift of Foucault, but the main question is that our library is dominated by the colonial library. If you make a Google search and you try to see the knowledge that is produced on African societies, is dominated by this colonial library. And the attempt was to criticize, to deconstruct this library, but also a second dimension is to acknowledge the fact that, yes, this knowledge exists, but African societies produce knowledge on their societies, and where those knowledge are, why we don't interact with them, and why we don't and why we don't acknowledge them, and why we don't try to understand how they operate, and why we don't try to create a space where we can articulate those knowledge with I would say, even though the term European could be criticized, the Western European, I think it's just it's a matter of laziness, because we know that the Western or the European is probably the modern knowledge. It's a place of synthesis. It's a place of aggregation of different type of history, epistemology, etc. Like so. But we use them for the sake of conversation. But we know that sometimes it's difficult at each step of the demonstration to criticize every category. So you have to choose a kind of common sense of languages by knowing that, okay, this term is much more complicated, but I'm going to use it for the sake of my demonstration. But the question is much more, I would say, the hegemony of the modern scientific knowledge on the other type of knowing. And this criticism, I think, it's a very fruitful one, because it opens spaces of being able to look differently. The last point, very quickly, the question of the truth it's a very interesting one. African philosopher Kwasi Wiredu, for example, they try to write in their African languages philosophical texts, Suleiman Bashir, Apia, and it was an interesting exercise because they were trying to say, to understand in their, I would say, in the imaginaries of their native languages, how some categories were transcribed and what was the deep meaning. And we make a piece around the question of true in the Akan languages. And true can be seen as just an adequation between the matter and the fact, the spirit and what is happening, etc. But it's much more complicated than that. You need to materialize object in a space-time to say this is true. But what is in the space of imaginary? What is in the space of the contingency? What is not yet here? What is arriving? How do you deal with those questions? If you're just interested by the question of the adequation between the matter and the fact, and if you just slide a bit and look at the Asian cosmologies and try to understand how they deal with those questions, probably you will end up thinking that we have to open the space of what true means and probably invite in the conversation different cosmologies of thought, different regimes of true, different way of seeing what is reality and how we can articulate the discourse on reality.
Thank you. I could continue, but well.
Thank you for that. So this question is a sort of, I suppose it's a question that's about assessing priorities or weighting things that are all of importance. And perhaps this question will allow you to further articulate your previous answer. Many people in the audience, in America in particular, I think, even those who are not as familiar with Francophone studies or French West Africa, Francophone Caribbean, may be familiar with the idea of negritude, which is an anti-colonial cultural and political movement birthed in the 1930s that remained a significant part of late colonial and early post-colonial West Africa, and indeed the 20th century. And I'm wondering, is there, in your opinion, a pressing need to continue to invest in efforts to restore authorship to Senegalese identity, for instance, and decentralize the West? Or are these issues, that is to say, the issues of reacting to and responding to colonial constructs, no longer among the most immediately pressing issues in contemporary West African culture and contemporary West African politics?
What I think is two things. The first, in Afrotopia, I was much more interested in opening a space of utopia, a new space, inventing the teleologies, metaphor of the future, and giving a space to the response or the deconstructions, but allowing much more space to the invention of something new. So it's mean no longer reacting, but creating, innovating, and proposing something, to unfold. And I think much of my efforts go to the second part of building of an Afrotopia. But I understand that negritude was a very important movement at that time in their context, and they had to respond. And I'm just trying to avoid a kind of non-accuracy of criticizing them by not taking into account their context and criticizing them from my point of view here and now. And probably if I'm here and now, I have built on their legacy. It's why I'm able to open other questions that they have already responded to. Cheikh Anta Diop, Senghor, all these movements, they have done an incredible work, and I think sometimes it's too easy to criticize them from the point of view where we are and not acknowledging the important stone that they have put in the way for us. Unfortunately, the questions they were dealing with are not solved. Racism is always here. Cultural superiority, the discourse of cultural superiority are always here in different forms. They are always here. Does it mean we have to respond in the same ways that they did? I don't think that we have to respond. I don't think that we have to dedicate a lot of amount of time, of energy to responding. And I think the better response is to create the world we want to create. But sometimes we have to stop the work of this creation and just respond quickly and continue the work. And I think these two attitudes are not dichotomic, but one have to choose. The amount of time is not infinite, the amount of, health, of energy. So you have to choose where do you put it. And if I have to choose, I would rather choose the space of invention, inventing something new, being aware of what is unsolved. But I think that we don't have to dedicate all our time to the unsolved questions, and probably dedicate much more time to set a stage for different type of questions and just to change the game and shift the game.
Yeah. Lovely answer. Yeah, I think that often we have this challenge of, if we're spending so much time on systems of oppression and things that limit us, are we reinforcing the power that they have? So it's really a thoughtful answer. And I'll just have a follow-up question, and then I think we're getting probably close to one more from you and then the audience. And this question is about museology, and I know you're not a museum professional, but with your report that you co-authored about Restitution, you are in the halls of museums all the time, being spoken about and thought about critically. And so just thinking about some of the things that we talked about at the top of this conversation with regard to rethinking and imagining new perspectives and new ways of understanding, new ways of knowing. My question is about that renewal, rediscovery, and the different modes the different ways that could take shape. And so from about roughly the 1860s through the Second World War, museums are created in Africa as they are elsewhere, firstly as a building, and secondly as a building that serves as a repository for collected, or hoarded perhaps is a more accurate term, items, wherein some of those items would be presented publicly to support biased ethnographies and European ideas about or interest in the peoples and places they confronted in so-called expeditions or otherwise as a result of colonial programs. These museums still exist for the most part. And of course, and so several decades post-colonialism, in your opinion, is there use for these museums in our contemporary times? Should we dissolve them and create new models for engagement at the intersection of art, education, and community? Because those are what museums do at their best, right? Or can something be salvaged or redeemed from or within the old model? And then I have follow-ups. If you think maybe we're moving towards the old model for museums becoming redundant, I would want to know, and I can repeat these questions, but I would want to know what are some of the ideas that you think might be a starting point for new models that might finally realize the best aspirations of these legacy museums, which in the 21st century, are often still limited, even if they're trying to innovate. It's very hard to be nimble and flexible, let alone radically change these institutions that are tethered to such a history of sort of violence and misunderstanding. And if you think that they are salvageable, I'd love to hear your ideas about how we can, how we can engage these collections that are imbued with these, again, violent and misunderstood histories and reposition that into something productive and transformative.
Sometimes you have a car and the car have a lot of problem, accident is broken, and you repair it, and you go for a while and another problem in the car and repair again. And most of the time, if you think deeply, you should consider that, no, I'm not repairing anymore. I'm just buying another car. I'm putting a lot of money, time, but it won't work. It's the feeling that I have with ethnographic museum, and I precise ethnographic. When we were writing the report and the debate arose, one of the main counter-argument against the restitution was, in African countries, you don't have good museums, you don't have skills, you don't know how to organize a good conservation. And our first response was to just count the number of museums in African countries. And we count 500 from the north to the south, and we create a map in the document, and we say in South Africa you have between 50 and 100, in Senegal you have 20 extra, and there is knowledge, there are skills extra. But it was a very bad response, because we were responding to I would say, neo-colonial question. And the neo-colonial question was, we are going to restitute if you are able to replicate our dispositif of patrimonializations. And when we went to African countries to do our field work, we went to Benin, Cameroon, Senegal, Mali, in a lot of countries, and we tried to just figure out where those objects came from. And we found that they weren't taken in museums. They weren't taken in different places, in different ecologies of the cultural heritage. Some in spiritual places, some in families, some in kingdoms, court, etc., etc. And we realize that African societies, they have a plurality of ecologies to take care of their cultural heritage, and every object, depending on its meaning or how this object activate a social space, were kept and in a specific place. And probably it was an interesting way of thinking, not just putting all the cultural heritage in one place, but disseminating in the social spheres, depending on how those objects or subjects were socialized. And the museum being one place, one ecology, and not being the place. And just the question shifted in our mind that the question was not the question of the museum, but the question was how African societies will decide to re-socialize those subject/object. Some could go to the universities for the sake of knowledge. Some could go to art and design places for artists. Some could go to the museum. Some could go to spiritual places. Some could go to the communities. And there's a diversity of space that can host the object/subject, and depending on the social role of the subject/object. It was a way of opening the question. And we did a colloquium in France with Benedict Savoy, and we titled it Museotopia. So it was a way of thinking how to reinvent that space. And before the restitution issue, a lot of criticism and a lot of questioning of the place of what is a museum and why are museums and how to reinvent it already exists. Pierre Bourdieu has done a very interesting work on that. And the status and the form of the museums was already a question, because the museum claimed to be a specific place with specific missions and objectives and aims. Is it true, extra, and how to reinvent it? But much more in African countries, there is a room for reinvention.
And so you just spoke about how the idea was to let African countries think about different ways and how all these objects are socialized in different ways, and let them, be that diverse instead of, this sort of the assumption in the question of, well, the museums don't have proper conservation or, humidity control. That assumption, there's an assumption in there that museums are important, and you're saying that's obviously not the point, and they're not that important. But you did list museums, so maybe some would go in a museum, and maybe some would go elsewhere, and that the museum is not the point. But I'm asking more about your personal opinion about like the significance of museums. Do you think, I think you started the question answering this with no, but I'm just making sure I understand. Do you think that museums, ethnographic museums, which is, even if museums don't call themselves that anymore and use language like encyclopedic, a lot of them are the legacy of ethnographic museums, and it's hard sometimes to change something radically that has such deep roots. Do you think there's hope for transforming those spaces into something that's meaningful and productive and responsive to the current moment and the future? Or do you think that we need to continue to imagine new ways to engage communities around art and cultural objects?
I have a counter example, is the Museum of Tervuren in Belgium. So they had this museum that was a celebration of colonialism and the gesture of Leopold II. And they decided to change it in an Africa museum and to transform it. And no one is happy. Because no one is happy. The African diaspora in Brussels or Belgium, they went there and they say, oh, the transformation is not very good. So there's a lot of traces of the colonial legacy and the colonial celebrations. The people who try to transform it, they're not all, they're happy. And sometimes I think that probably, I won't say erasing, but starting something new could be a better option of trying to transform what ended up becoming very difficult to transform, because the DNA of the colonial legacy is so deep in those spaces. And if those spaces are problematic, why don't we reinvent them from scratch?
Thank you for that.
Yeah. Okay. One more question, and actually this is perfect because it's very much related to this conversation, especially the exchange about the negitudes movement. And there's obviously, I think that there's a generation of I would say the African diasporic thinkers, because I think the negitude was not simply, if there's one moment where we have a clear moment of a critical response from what we might call the global blackness, it's probably there. And I think that this continues today. And of course there is this slight bifurcation, which I sensed, where on the one hand, you'd say, there was some sort of nostalgic attachment to a pre-colonial past. This does not serve us anymore. But I also heard the other kind of generous reading, which is very sensible or sensitive to the context. But you said something that now says something that actually echoed the theme of your the second atelier, which was the politics of time. And it's interesting how in your exchange with Lauren, you actually also mapped out something that's quite I think it's legible in both volumes. You have the moment of critique, which is responding, I would say atelier number 1. But the second atelier, really, you see that the theme is really about invention. And so I always wondered, so the first part of the question is how you understand invention. Because one of the way that I see you and actually in a number of contributors, the future, there's something like a possible future, or at least there's you can push back. There's slightly a bit of a programmatic understanding of the future, in the sense that you can actually say or have a sense of what you're inventing. Whereas so the future is always in relation to the possible. Reality is also obviously the present, and the future seems to be also somewhat sufficiently intelligible, and therefore the invention somewhat can be thought about clearly, right? So I wonder what do you understand? How do you both understand the politics of time and its relationship to your own notion of utopia, or at least your reclaiming of the notion of utopia? I hate to do this, but I'm going to have to read another paragraph just to give a sense to the audience of what. So this is the introduction with Achille in the second volume, The Politics of Time, and you're basically trying to define what you mean by the politics of time. So I quote: "More than ever, the world is dominated by the specter of its own end and by the fear of obliteration and extinction. With the collapse of grand hopes for transformation, the idea of a happy ending was thrown out. opening the door to a proliferation of cynical fictions, beliefs, and multiple forms of bewitchment. Two forms of disenchanted thinking dominate our era. The first, apocalyptic thinking, invites us to contemplate the coming collapse and to plan for the end. The other applies itself to the task of rethinking utopia and the future in the language of a technological messianism. And you ask, is it possible to politicize time beyond the alternative of apocalypse and a neologism that I very much enjoy, technolatry or technolatry, relation of technology. So where does the project, the Afrotopia project, stand at a moment where even Senegal has joined the race to space and is now with the Chinese, where they've launched their first satellites recently. So where does Afrotopia stand, and how would you answer? Because obviously utopia seems to be very much a question of creation and invention. So what is the status of Felwine's Afrotopia, given the,
I think it's
the dark time that we're in?
You're absolutely right. It's the main question. African head of states, elite, and I'm going very quickly. I want to put everyone in the same place or basket, but most of them, we have our imaginaries that are already inhabited by this technological eschatology, by this way of seeing progress that is driven by a single imaginaries of what is the future or what is a desirable future. And one of the most difficult questions is to just heal ourselves or to open the space of imaginaries of how we could think, imagine, and conceive alternative futures. And the horizon is it is mainly blocked and blurred by this just non-ability we have to just jump outside of those imaginaries. And my head of states, I think he's very happy to say that Senegal has a satellite that Senegal is launching in the space. Now we are just joining the nation of technology, blah, 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 blah. We are modernizing the country, extra, or we are developing the country. So the future needs to be thought, imagined, and planned, even though it never unfolds as it is imagined. So you know it at the beginning. But the task of inventing the future is a task of opening the materiality of history, saying that we are able not just to replicate the path, but just to change it or to open it. And I think it's a hell fit task for a society to invent or to reinvent. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, because I know we're out of time, really quickly, because this bifurcation, like the right before this paragraph that I just read, what shouldn't you say is just that Africa is actually that place where one encounters multiple times the entanglement of a plurality of times. You even call it migrating time or time migrating, migrating time, I think, or something like that. I mean, I'll find the word again, but and then so time is never linear, so there's this repetition, right? And it seems like when you said to Lauren, we're still dealing with the same thing that Negritude was dealing with. Like, these problems are actually still with us, but in a different time. So I think that's where you and Axelle were talk about this, like Africa being this place where there is a convergence of multiple kind of times. But yet in this part of the concluding part of the essay, you seems to be separating the apocalyptic and the apocalyptic, or that eschatological thinking, and the question of invention. So I wonder, why is this bifurcation actually held solid to think about invention and creating? Because if you want to, one thing that we can say, one of the I would say, I would describe the historicity of the African crisis as being one very much, punctuated by many ends, many apocalypses. And I think most indigenous people would say the same. So could we think about, the space of ending and the space of inventing, that apocalypse and what is to come together? And perhaps I'm just basically thinking about, how do we think about, or I'm asking you, how do we think about utopia, or how do we rethink about utopia at this moment where, the end is here and yet is not here? Maybe the thinking the future from the African continent might allow us to, I think this kind of a resource, this entanglement of times, is a resource that we already have recorded both in our history and our culture, as well as our myths. So, yeah.
Yes, it's not an easy question, but what I can say is that probably one of the tasks we have is to acknowledge the plurality and of temporality and how they intertwine, and how probably one have to get rid of the linear teleology of the historical narration, and to acknowledge the plurality of historical temporality and how they are here at the same time in a contemporaneous time, and you don't have to divide them, and this changed the way we look at the future or the progress. The modern teleology was to say that, okay, progress will come in a linear time and will bring something that is better. And now we know that time can unfold at the same time the opposite. And actually, we are in a time of ecological crisis and ecological consciousness of the crisis, with a fear of an ecocide or futuricide. And most of the narratives, some of them are trying to respond to that fear of ecocides. So all the ecological discourse is a response to that end of time that is programmed. And the opposite dominant discourse is the technological one, or the technological eschatology. We are going to solve them by going to Mars and make it livable. Elon Musk and those kind of stuff, etc., etc. Just, bringing the link that we have with the Earth and just migrating, and technology will save us. And the question for us was, are we able to think a different discourse that is not caught in that alternative from our historical experience of being at a space of a plurality of temporalities, and with the necessity of always proposing an atopos in a space of thought and imaginaries.
Very quickly, but space is not a new moment in Africa. There are plenty of evidence that pre-colonial Africa had a relationship with space.
No, they have the relationship with space, but
it's not necessarily technological.
Yes, but it was a relation of conquering space. It was a different relation with space, and probably there is here something interesting to look on how they relate with that dimension outside of the gesture of captation, of conquering, of settling, etc., etc., or taking resources for them. The same gesture of extractivism that we just translate from here to there.
Thank you very much, Felwine, Lauren, and Axelle.